it is time for Darren now. Darren Shaw is Senior Assessment and Quality Manager at the Institute for Apprenticeships, and I hand over to him now. Thank you, Darren.
Thank you. Okay, good morning. Thank you for letting me come to speak to you today. I'm trying to look at the screen up there, but it's very far away. So if I look at the screen, I apologise. My glasses aren't very good anymore. So what I'm going to talk about today is the Institute, really, and our role within the landscape. We're still a very new organisation, relatively speaking, not quite a year old yet. So just give it a high level. It will be a high level, I'm afraid. I haven't got a lot of time. A high level overview of our role, what we see our role is, and some of the key parts of that role that maybe affect some people in the audience to quite a large extent. So, okay, so I'm going to talk, as I said, about the role of the Institute, the importance of endpoint assessment as we see it, and on quite a large scale. Internal quality assurance, I'll touch on that, and also touch on external quality assurance. Okay, so firstly, the role of the Institute. So I'm sure you've heard this quote before, but essentially, our chair has articulated our vision for the future of apprenticeships and the value they add to the economy and to people's life chances and so on. And as a result of that, and trying to drive that forward, the government set up the Institute, which has a remit to oversee the process, but also a key part of our remit, which I'll talk about in a moment, is driving up quality of the apprenticeships. So, our general background and objectives. They are, as I said, primarily to drive the quality of apprenticeships, both in the training, but also particularly in the assessment and in the EPA itself, of course. We are a permanent feature of the landscape. That's intentional. We're going to be here, going to be at the centre of the apprenticeship landscape as we move forward, as a focus for it, so that facilitates our role in driving up the quality of the apprenticeship system. We, having said that, are not going to be driving the content of the system, so we see very much the employers as being key to this, and they will drive forward and plan and so on the standards, the apprenticeships. We will just facilitate and coordinate this. And then also, I'm sure this is important to a lot of people in the room, there is obviously a requirement which is set out in statute of a 20% off-the-job training requirement in the apprenticeships, and also the EPA, the change in the model away from continuous on-programme assessments to a clear, defined period of assessment post-gateway to assess competence, occupational competence of the apprentice. So two very big changes, I'm sure you're very aware of. So our core functions to facilitate this involve maintaining quality criteria for this programme, as I said, to drive the quality across the piece. To support, we have a role in setting policy. We have a role also in facilitating the development of standards and assessment plans, as I said, so working with trailblazers, working with employers in route panels and so on. We then have a role in publishing the documentation. You'll find those on our website. They were currently on Gov UK, but now on our website and will be in the future. We have a role in the funding aspects. We don't have complete control over the funding of apprenticeships. That still lies with the DfE, but what we do is recommend a funding band, and then it's for DfE to decide if they take a recommendation. And then at the end of the process, we have a role in quality assuring the system. And we have two roles within that. We have a role as an EQA provider in our own right. As someone mentioned earlier on, we are the EQA provider of last resort. But we also have a role a level above that, where we oversee the EQA providers. The reform model, which I'll talk about later on, but we have an overseeing role. So we exist within 2 points in the system, in the EQA system. Okay, so I appreciate it's quite small, but I haven't got a pointer, unfortunately. But essentially, this is our structure and how employers engage with it. So at the bottom, you'll see there are 15 route panels, each one per industrial sector. The route panels, they're appointed from within their own sector, so they're employers. They are, when standards and assessment plans come through the system, our internal system, they are looked at by peer reviewers who also come from industry. They will make a recommendation as whether they accept the plan or not the plan, and not accept the plan, and maybe impose some conditions themselves. Assuming they therefore then approve the plan, it goes through to a funding and approval committee, which is a subset of our board. Our board obviously also represents industry. So they're the three key points, and obviously before that there's a trailblazer that's devising these standards and assessment plans. Okay, so talk about the importance of endpoint assessment from our point of view. So the reason for the change is that continuous assessment was seen to be a very good way of assessing individual skills, quite atomistically devising and assessing and marking off the skills with an apprenticeship, but not so good at saying whether this person in the round is competent across the piece for their occupation. And government was being told that employers were employing apprentices who successfully passed through an apprenticeship programme, have proof of everything that was devised the skill and so on as part of the apprenticeship signed off, but they couldn't then do the job. So that is one of the main drivers for moving into our system we have now. Also, it was felt that the continuous assessment, the ongoing assessment that went on during the apprenticeship programme, was expensive, and that money could be better spent on actually training. So by removing the ongoing assessment to an endpoint, we could reduce the overall funding allocation for the assessment element and redivert that money into training. So the idea being that training would improve in quality, and the apprentice would actually be assessed in the round, and that would therefore drive back into the apprenticeship training programme to develop a round apprentice rather than one who can take off a series of skills. That was also summarised in the Richard Review, and as we mentioned already, that another change was that this system, the endpoint assessment, will be taken and undertaken by organisations which are now what is called the Register of Endpoint Assessment Organisations. So taking it out and separating it from the training element. Okay, a very brief overview of the process as development of assessment plans. So assessment plan is developed by the trailblazer with support, as always been mentioned, from the Institute, both from the relationship manager who works directly with that trailblazer and also with my team, because we work in the assessment team advising as appropriate. Certain issues come up sometimes, or some queries and so on. The assessment plan is approved and published, so it's approved by the process I just showed you in the last slide, going through, first of all, our team to check that the assessments are working from an assessment point of view, and then going to the trailblazers the root panel to decide if it works from a sector point of view. Assuming it has been, it will then be published by the IFA. The EAPAO, once the standard is published, they can then register against that standard on the register, and that's overseen by the ESFA. On our behalf, we have an overriding policy responsibility for the register, but it's managed by the ESFA. The EPA will then develop their assessment materials, which is not directly our part, and then we will come later on at some point, and EQA, or an equivalent EQA provider, will come along and EQA that particular assessment. So you can see where we engage as an institute in different roles in different parts of the process. Okay, so things I've mentioned already, so support from the relationship manager, approved assessment plan, and external quality assurance. So 3 key points of our role. Okay, so how we see the role of the endpoint assessment organisation, in that you develop content, or they develop content, the tests and tools and instruments and so on. They agree with the cost of the endpoint assessment with the employer. You recruit, as we mentioned already, recruit, train, manage your assessors. Check and verify the apprentice has met the gateway requirements. That's an EPAO responsibility. Conduct the EPA, of course. Internally quality assure their own processes and procedures and so on. And that's obviously monitored by access to the entry to the register and also our EQA. Also make themselves, as I mentioned, be auditable, so make themselves available to be audited by the EQA provider, whoever that may be in their particular standard. Identify and record when the EPA and the apprentice has passed the EPA, and then finally they apply for the certification, the official certification. Lots of certificates given by different organisations, but from our point of view there is one certificate that's issued by the ESFA. So let's take the picture. Okay, so internal quality assurance, a bit more about that. So the EPAOs are responsible for undertaking individual assessments and scrutiny of their own processes and so on, to make sure that the process is running from their point of view correctly, marking is done correctly, the correct outcomes are being assigned to apprentices, standardisation is going on and so on, all that things underpins that, and reporting the outcomes to the external stakeholders, be the employer, be the ESFA for the awarding of certificates and so on. So as part of that, and obviously to get on the register, you must have these in place anyway, but you must have place in policies and procedures to facilitate that. So a lot of checking of the system will happen within EPAOs. So this will include, but won't be limited to these, describing the moderating process, stipulating essential occupational competence of your assessors, stipulating assessment knowledge of the assessors, and people talked earlier on about them, individuals not necessarily having both elements, and that's obviously very important and something that will need to be addressed. There's, as also someone mentioned earlier on as well, there's an ongoing training requirement placed on the EPOs to develop their assessors, both in their own procedures and policies and materials, but also in assessment practice. Around standardisation, to make sure the marking is valid and the outcomes themselves are valid, and then specifying the tools, materials and techniques used in the assessment. That's a very high level list. There'll be a lot more nuanced versions of that within your organisations, I'm sure, and there may well be specific things that apply to a particular standard because of an occupational element within that standard. But they, as a common theme, is very, very important. And then it talked briefly about external quality assurance. So it's designed to ensure the consistency and the quality of the approach assessments across the system. So looking at a higher level, looking at ensuring that comparability is being achieved. So obviously within some standards there are, I think currently up to 10 or so, maybe more, on the individual standards, several organisations operating within a single standard, assessing a single standard. So it's important for us therefore that, albeit they may have robust internal processes, that we are checking that the EPA is consistent between those organisations, so that the certificate we're awarding has validity, and most importantly we can assure the employers, the public, the apprentices, that regardless of which organisation assessed that apprentice, the outcome of that is an accurate reflection of their occupational competence. Also, another key role from our point of view of the EQA process, it will drive, one of our major drivers of driving quality as it moves into a mature system. So part of the EQA's responsibility is to not only check what's going on now, but also check how it's being applied, how the assessment plans are working, and identify issues caused by the assessment plan itself in terms of interpretation. So some people mentioned that some of the older ones particularly quite difficult to put into practice, so we're very interested in knowing what those things are so that we can then address those within the plans. So we are essentially checking the work that we have let go through and the work of our predecessor organisations have let go through. So there is a loop back within the system. There are there's a model, four-way model of providing EQA. That may be an employer group, which can be set up obviously by the trailblazer but others as well, but it must be a legal entity, it must exist in its own right. It can be a professional body if one is available and the professional body is willing to take on that work. It's one of the reasons why that model is perhaps not so widely used, is because even if there is a professional body in place, they may prefer to be an EPAO and they can't be both. That does limit the market quite significantly. Ofqual, which have their own requirements. So there's, as I'm sure you know, for Trailblazer, once a standard assessment plan to be EQA by Ofqual, Ofqual will also have to sign it off and they go through the similar process. And we are doing a lot of work at the moment to align our processes to remove, there have been in the past some instances where the two processes have rubbed against each other a little bit. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment to streamline that. And finally, as the EQA provider of last resort, the Institute for Apprenticeships. But we're quite popular. We don't direct any employer to choose us, it's their free choice. We represent about 25% of these standards. So we're not the majority by any means. We're the largest single, but we're not the majority. Okay, so what does EQA cover? The process may differ slightly between different providers and how it's done. But the key points they will all look at include standards and assessment plans are fit for purpose, as I said. The assessment plan is valid and can be used in practice and is providing the outcomes that we expect it to do. The validity, reliability, comparability, dependence, the assessment methods are in reality right, essentially. So making sure that the assessment itself works, and also looking at assessor competence. which is a key point. So the assessors themselves will be examined, and the processes, wherever they are in the process when the EQA happens. And then if it's not, the EQA is not carried out on our behalf by Open Awards, if it's by another EQA body, they are obliged to then give their findings to us. So we, as I said, have a separate role overseeing the EQA providers and also taking information they are collecting and using that to drive up the quality within the system as a whole. So the EQA provider cannot come EQA an assessment and then keep everything they've discovered in-house. They can't do that. So that's essentially the end of a very quick whistle-stop tour of our role. I will around this morning if anyone wants to have any, grab me for any particular concerns or queries, I should say. But thank you very much.
Join us on the